society would tolerate so many dictatorships in so many different parts of the world, and then they get confused about America.
Thank you. In a moment, Peter will take the first detailed look at our poll, focusing on the world's view of America's political influence. But first, some thoughts from around the globe.
It's an evil and nasty world, and somebody has to stand up for freedom and individual rights.
I think that power corrupts, and America is too powerful at present.
Look at the alternative. A victory in the Cold War by the Soviet Union of Leonid Brezhnev, or a victory for Mao's communist China. I think America's victory is a benefit to all mankind, not only the United States and the West.
Suddenly it's as if a giant has woken up and acknowledges its power and knows that there's no other rival on this earth.
We have engaged in some extremely altruistic enterprises. The Marshall Plan was probably the most altruistic act in history.
America can be a force for good. Not right now. It isn't. But it could be. Right now it's been very violent, and it has played the role of the bully.
It's arrogant, it's unilateral, it is kind of paranoid. That's new, and that's dangerous.
There's always going to be much more criticism because of that leadership role, and so I think that most people, you know, the world has somewhat of a love-hate relationship with this country.
Well, it's clear that very many people we spoke to in the 10 countries outside the USA have deep misgivings about the way it exercises its power. And they're anxious, too, about what they see as America's lofty attitude to the outside world. We put to people Tony Blair's remark, America is a force for good in the world. Did they agree or did they disagree? Well, America's closest allies among the 10, 4 countries, including Britain, agree. The other 6, stand by, the red ones, disagree with Tony Blair that America is a force for good. Overall, of the 10,000 people we spoke to outside the US, 41% agree with Tony Blair, 55% disagree. Is the USA arrogant or humble, we ask people? The majority of people who have a view in every country, and that includes the USA itself, funnily enough, say that America is arrogant. Overall, the figure is 65% who think the USA is too full of itself. And I emphasize here again that this is not a representative sample of all the people in the world, just our 11 countries scattered around the globe. The United States can draw some encouragement from the answer people give when asked if America is antagonistic or friendly. Now, 7 countries, including, of course, the US, say the US is friendly. But majorities in 3, Brazil, Jordan, and Indonesia, say the US is antagonistic. And in France, well, there's a tie between the 2 sides. The French can't make up their minds. Never mind. Overall, 47% say the USA is friendly, and 33% say it's antagonistic. We then went on to ask if people felt the USA's military presence in their part of the world brings peace and stability. In Korea and Israel, 2 allies deeply dependent on the USA, nearly 2/3 say yes to this question. Many more than say no down here. And American power gets marginal approval from 3 other American allies, including Britain. But France, Indonesia, Russia, and Jordan return heavy majorities saying no to any security benefit from the exercise of US military power in their area. In contrast, a huge majority of the Americans themselves believe that their presence around the world does bring stability, 80%. But again, a more positive note is there too, even among the pessimists. One of America's big celebrities famously said, "America scares me." Well now, is that a worldwide view? Apparently not. Only majorities in Brazil and South Korea say they tremble in fear of America. In all the other 8 countries, most people say they're not scared of the old stars and stripes. So, which Hollywood star, you may wonder, was it who said America scares me? None other than Top Gun hero Tom Cruise. Right, let's go worldwide now and get some more detail from our partner broadcasters, something we'll be doing throughout the program. Lamis El Hadidi is in Jordan. Lamis.
Well, Peter, very interesting results from Jordan. In fact, we find that although Jordan has scored the highest in the negative attitude among all the 11 countries polled against the U.S., however, 78% of the Jordanians do not fear America. America does not scare them. Why is that? Is that a surprise? No, that is not a surprise, in fact. 50% of the Jordanians are from Palestinian origin. They believe that the Palestinian conflict is their own local conflict. So they hate America for their double standards in the region, for their bias towards Israeli policies. However, they're not scared from America. They are in a defiance and a confrontational state against the American power. And another very interesting question, 75% of the Jordanians do not believe that U.S. military can bring peace and stability in the world. Had this question been asked after the 91 liberation of Kuwait, had the Americans pulled out from Iraq after toppling the regime of Saddam Hussein, maybe this answer might have been different. However, the violence used against opposition in Iraq and the persistence to maintain Israeli military superpower that is being used against Palestinian civilians resulted in that answer. We also find that 71% of the Jordanians believe that America is far more dangerous than Al-Qaeda. This is a very tricky question because it does not reflect a sympathy towards Al-Qaeda, rather than it reflects the despair and the frustration and the anger against American policies. The people in this region, in fact, have suffered the impact of Al-Qaeda attacks, whether on their economies after the September 11 or on their lives after what happened in Riyadh and in Casablanca. Peter?
Lamis, thank you very much for that from Jordan. And now for what I suspect will be a rather different point of view is Jacob Eilon in Tel Aviv, Israel. Jacob.
Yes, Peter, when it comes to Israel, you'll find it almost always right there next to Canada and the UK, sometimes even much closer to the US itself. In the poll conducted for this program, you'll see, for example, that only Americans support George Bush more than Israelis. 62% of Israelis have favorable view of Bush. Only 33% have an unfavorable view. This is really part of a long, ongoing relationships between Israel and the US that go back to the birth of the State of Israel and its mere existence. For example, when you asked to comment on the statement, America scares me, 82% of Israelis said no, only 17% said yes. And you know what's funny? Americans are more scared of America than Israelis. And it's not really surprising after most Israelis see America as free, friendly, and fair in its foreign policy. But more than that, I think Israelis feel close to Americans, to American culture, consumer products, music, movies, and values. And many Israelis have relatives living overseas, and many young Israelis, men and women, like to spend some time in New York or LA or in one of the universities overseas. Tensions tend to rise, though, whenever there's a political pressure by the US. The political right here in Israel criticizes the US harshly whenever that happens. But I think fundamentally America is always perceived as a friend of Israel. And it's very interesting to note that on policy towards the Palestinians, 50% of Israelis do not agree with the US, 44% approve. This is, I guess, part of seeing America as the only true friend around the world for Israel in many eyes of Israelis here. It is, of course, in total contrast to Europe. I can tell you that I just got today an invitation for an international seminar in one of the universities here under the title Israel in Europe, What Went Wrong? And this, of course, would have never happened with the US. Peter.
Jacob, thank you very much indeed. Now, right the way across the other side of the world to Renato Machado in Rio, in Brazil, who can tell us, I hope, why so many Brazilians say they fear the US. Renato.
Well, Peter, in Brazil, 62% of the people agree with the statement, America scares us. And on top of that somewhat inflated figure, there is another which also requires closer examination. 72% disagree that America is a force for good in the world. The figures are indeed surprising. Now, could one explain why this is? For one thing, I believe Brazilians have always had a sort of mistrust towards the strong economic position of the United States in the continent. I think they have always feared the supremacy of a regional power, in this case the world's greatest. Brazil has gone through many economic crises in the last few years, all of them in a way dictated by world financial instability. Maybe the IMF, which eventually rescued Brazil, is seen as an extension of America and its government. Besides, Brazilians are sensitive about their natural resources. Maybe they fear for the Amazon basin, which is a tremendous reserve of wealth. In their imagination, maybe they create fantastic scenarios like the Amazon being object of foreign greed. More than half have an unfavorable feeling towards America, and a significant majority have an unfavorable attitude towards President Bush. One should consider that national sentiment in Brazil opposes aggression and all wars for that matter. They like to stress their tradition of pacifism. They probably see President Bush's America as a far cry from this model.
Claire Short, we were hearing just now the proposition from Tom Cruise, among others, America scares me. You've been alongside American power. Your time in government, you've seen the American government operating at very close hands. Does America scare you?
The mood America is in now scares me. I think post-September 11th, it's a wounded giant full of anger that it wants to find someone to beat up, to punish for this. I think it was too impatient on Iraq. Iraq needed dealing with, the people were suffering, but they needed more wisdom in the use of its power. So this angry, hurt America that feels got at and feels it's got to exercise its power all over the world, I think that's becoming a frightening America. I mean, prior to that, I mean, it's absolutely true, under the Clinton administration, there was still, America found multilateralism difficult, didn't go with Kyoto, didn't go with the International Criminal Court, always found the UN difficult. So to say it's just Bush isn't fair.
But you would see
but I think
the presidency of
post-September the
George
11th, this kind of raging, angry, hurt America is frightening for the world and frightening for America, because if the world feels bullied by America and it's all about America's power, and if the world hates America more, we'll get more terrorism, more bitterness, more division. It will hurt all of us.
Now, nowhere is the bitterness and the division worse than in the Middle East. Saeb Erekat, if you could imagine a world in which there was not the Palestinian-Israeli conflict going on and America's deep engagement in that, do you think that the polls, the way the world saw America, would just look completely different?
Absolutely. I go back to 1919, when the people of Palestine, Jordan, and the Middle East were asked by the League of Nations, who do you want to come as a fact-finding mission? They said no to the British, no to the French, and this is why the King Crane delegation came as a fact-finding mission.
Then you wanted the Americans?
Because of the history of who was colonizing this region, British and the French, and now the United States double standards vis-a-vis Israel. But you have to add to that the lack of a just solution to the Palestinian problem and the tolerance of the Israeli occupation, and the United States treating Israel as a country above the laws of man is one dimension. The other dimension here is what kind of allies the U.S. has in the Middle East. When they speak about democracy, I don't think the allies in the Middle East are the cousins or relative of Montesquieu or Voltaire. And that's creating so much frustration in the Arab world. 7 years, Saddam Hussein is a good dictator fighting Iran, and then he turns into a bad dictator in the eyes of the Americans because he goes into Kuwait. And that's the situation. People in the Middle East want to put an end to all of this. And the main important point is to realize now, how do the Arabs perceive President Bush? Do they take him as the President of the United States or as the President of the Arab Republic of Iraq? That's very important.
I think we know the answer to that. I suspect we do. Fareed Zakaria, if there wasn't, on the other hand, the Arab-Israel conflict, do you think that there would always be somewhere around the world that would be picked upon by America's enemies? America's just so powerful, there will always be a crunch issue.
Well, I think that one of the great features of the attitudes towards the United States, I would say, is not really hate, but deep and bitter disappointment. There's always a sense that the United States should be solving some great world problem. So that take Kyoto. Most European countries had actually not ratified the Kyoto Protocol. Almost none of them are following the limits that Kyoto requires. But when the United States says publicly what is in fact plainly true, that the Kyoto Protocol was going nowhere, it became this deep wound because it signaled that the world's greatest power was not serious about energy conservation. The United States is urged to